Beneath the flickering light of candles, a jar sat on a wooden apothecary shelf inside it. Not herbs, not minerals, but powder made from the crushed flesh of Egyptian mummies. For centuries, Europeans believed this gruesome substance could cure disease, restore youth, and even add years to life itself. Pharaohs long buried in sacred tombs were ground to dust and swallowed by kings and peasants alike. Stay with me because what you're about to hear is one of history's darkest, most grotesque trades. And before we step deeper into this horror, make sure you subscribe if you dare, so you don't miss the stories the world was never meant to remember. The origins of this macabre practice trace back to a single mistake, the mistranslation of the word mumia. In Arabic texts, it referred to bitumen, a natural resin thought to have healing qualities. But Europeans twisted the meaning, confusing it with the preserved bodies of ancient Egypt. From this error, an empire of desecration was born. Soon, physicians, nobles, and merchants across Europe sought to harness the supposed power of the dead. Imagine the bustling streets of Renaissance Venice or Paris. In apothecaries, alongside jars of cinnamon and saffron, lay vials of mummy powder. Dark, bitter-smelling dust sold at a price higher than gold. The rich purchased it as a luxury tonic, while the poor scraped wages together, desperate to taste what was believed to be the essence of kings and gods. The dead had become currency. One chilling diary from 16th century France describes a noble woman bedridden with consumption. Her physician prescribed powdered mummy mixed with wine. She wrote of the taste. It was bitter like earth and ash. My mother said it would renew my blood. I prayed as I swallowed Pharaoh himself. This was no fringe belief. Mummy powder was recommended by some of Europe's most respected doctors. Merchants turned greed into industry. Caravans raided Egyptian tombs, stripping sacred wrappings from ancient corpses, crushing bones beneath stone pestles, and shipping barrels of dust across the Mediterranean. By night, smugglers desecrated tombs under the desert moon, the air thick with the stench of decay as they plundered the resting places of pharaohs for profit. Not all the powder sold in Europe came from ancient tombs. The demand was so insatiable that counterfeiters emerged. Executed criminals, paupers, and even fresh corpses were dried in ovens coated with pitch and sold as new mummies. Apothecaries assured customers it was genuine, but behind the scenes, death itself was manufactured, packaged, and sold as medicine. The sensory experience of consuming mummy powder was unforgettable and horrifying. Patients described its acrid, smoky smell, its gritty texture between the teeth, the bitter taste clinging to the throat. Some gagged and vomited, others fainted, but all were told this suffering was proof of its power. You are swallowing Pharaoh's strength. Physicians insisted even as patients grew weaker. The craze reached royal courts. Kings, queens, and popes consumed the black powder in elaborate rituals. Physicians mixed it into wine, ale, even chocolate. Some rulers hoarded jars in their private cabinets of curiosities, believing that drinking the flesh of the dead would grant them victory over death itself. Europe's elite were feasting on Egypt's graves, but behind the grandeur lay horror. Tomb robbers in Egypt left necropolises in ruin. Sacred burial grounds ripped apart, mummies shattered and ground into dust. Locals watched helplessly as their ancestors were shipped away in crates. The cries of the desecrated dead seemed to echo across the desert sands carried by the wind. Yet still the trade grew stronger. For centuries, silence allowed this nightmare to continue. Priests blessed the powder doctors prescribed it, and merchants profited. Communities drank their medicine without question, never realizing they were swallowing death. And as the demand grew, so too did the darkness. What began as a superstition became an empire of horror that consumed not just the dead, but the living who trusted it. By the 17th century, the mummy trade had reached its peak. Apothecaries in London, Paris, and Venice openly advertised jars of powdered flesh, claiming it cured epilepsy, bleeding, and even the plague. Physicians who doubted the remedy were often silenced to question. It was to challenge a system supported by kings, nobles, and the church itself. The gruesome powder had become so normalized that it was prescribed alongside rosewater and honey, as if it were no different from herbs. Travelers to Egypt recorded the devastation firsthand. They described tombs split open, mummies dragged into the daylight, their wrappings torn away and bones broken for shipment. Whole caravans carried the dead across the desert, their sacred bodies reduced to cargo. In markets, buyers pawed at blackened limbs, testing their texture before grinding them into dust. Ancient Egypt's grandeur was reduced to ash in Europe's pharmacies. One account tells of a German physician who traveled to Cairo in search of genuine supplies. He entered a bazaar where rows of corpses lay stacked, some ancient, some suspiciously fresh. He later confessed in horror that many were the bodies of executed criminals baked in ovens and painted with bitumen to mimic pharaohs. Still, he bought them, shipped them home, and sold them to eager patients. His conscience bowed to profit. The obsession with mummy powder also created an aura of luxury and secrecy. Wealthy nobles hosted feasts where the tonic was served as a rare delicacy. Guests whispered of its power to prolong life, some even believing it infused them with the strength of Egyptian gods. Behind velvet curtains, aristocrats raised cups of blackened wine, toasting not with health, but with desecration. But the powder was not harmless. Some who consumed it fell violently ill, racked with fever, vomiting, and delirium. Records show that many patients died soon after ingesting it. The same substance hailed as medicine was in fact poisoning those who believed in it. Yet physicians explained away the deaths, claiming the dosage had been wrong or that the illness was too severe. The lie was more comforting than the truth. By now, dissenting voices began to surface. A few doctors whispered that mummy powder was dangerous, that it carried disease and decay rather than healing. Priests questioned whether consuming the dead was an act of blasphemy. But such critics were ridiculed, dismissed as ignorant or cowardly. The machine of profit drowned out doubt, fueled by fear and greed. Folklore grew around the practice. Villagers claimed those who drank too much mummy powder were cursed, their skin turning pale and ashen, their dreams haunted by pharaohs seeking revenge. Tales spread of ghostly figures wandering European streets, their mouths blackened from swallowing the dead. Whether true or not, these stories reveal the unease lurking beneath society's obsession. In one chilling case, a French nobleman ordered his physicians to supply him with mummy powder daily. After months, he developed strange ulcers and blackened gums. His servants whispered that he smelled of earth and death. When he finally collapsed, his personal physician wrote that his body had become the very tomb he consumed. The horror was not metaphor, it was real. Still, the trade endured. Merchants became rich, their ships heavy with crates of desiccated flesh. Some carried not just powder, but whole mummies sold to collectors who displayed them as curiosities before eventually grinding them down. Egypt's sacred heritage was reduced to fuel for Europe's hunger, its kings and queens, priests and generals devoured for profit. And so, the cycle continued. Death feeding life, superstition masquerading as science, silence protecting greed. The jar of mummy powder sat on shelves across Europe, a grim reminder that humanity's thirst for survival can justify even the most grotesque of horrors. But the cracks in the empire were beginning to show, and soon the very substance once hailed as miraculous would be exposed as poison. The cracks widened when physicians began keeping private notes revealing their doubts. One English doctor recorded that many patients worsened after taking mummy powder, yet still demanded it, convinced by superstition. He confessed in his journal, "It is not healing, but decay we give them, and yet they thank us as if we bring them salvation." His words, hidden from the public, show the dissonance between truth and profit that fueled the trade. By the mid-1600s, entire industries had sprung up around counterfeit mummies. In Cairo, workshops operated in secret, baking fresh corpses in lime and resin before shipping them as ancient relics. The process was gruesome bodies laid out on slabs, ovens roaring the air thick with stench. Laborers scraped skin and bone into pieces, their hands blackened with soot. What was once the sacred art of embalming had been twisted into industrial slaughter. One chilling testimony came from a traveler who witnessed these forgeries. He wrote of a man newly dead stretched upon a table, his limbs painted with pitch and sold as a relic of Egypt. The traveler admitted he purchased some himself, ashamed, yet complicit. The horror of the trade was not hidden, it was normalized, and those who saw it often chose silence over resistance. At the same time, Europe's appetite only grew. Apothecaries advertised mummy powder as a cure for everything from headaches to plague. Posters promised vitality, fertility, and protection against evil. Wealthy clients demanded it by the jar, while peasants saved coins to purchase mere pinches. Even as reports of illness spread, the allure of Pharaoh's flesh proved irresistible. In palaces, the practice reached grotesque heights. Some monarchs mixed mummy powder into their daily regimen, alongside gold leaf and exotic spices. Courtiers competed to obtain the purest samples, boasting of their connections to distant merchants. Behind the gilded doors of royal chambers, the rulers of Europe consumed the ashes of the dead, convinced they were swallowing eternity. Yet whispers of fear never faded. Some clergy denounced the practice as cannibalism cloaked in medicine. They warned that consuming human remains invited curses, that Egypt's long-dead kings would rise in vengeance. Though dismissed as superstition, such warnings carried weight in villages where ghost stories spread like wildfire. Many peasants believed those who swallowed mummy powder were haunted until death, and perhaps they were. One noblewoman described waking from nightmares in which her bed was surrounded by skeletal figures, their hollow eyes accusing her. She believed she heard whispers in the dark, voices speaking in a language she could not understand. Her physician assured her it was fever, but her servants swore she screamed the word Pharaoh in her sleep. Even among the educated, cracks appeared in faith. Enlightenment thinkers began to ridicule the idea of powdered corpses as medicine. Writers mocked apothecaries, comparing their shelves to charnel houses. Satirical plays depicted nobles choking on dust while peasants laughed in disbelief. Slowly, ridicule began to erode belief more effectively than sermons ever had. But still, the trade persisted in shadows. Desperate families clung to the remedy when plague struck, when no other cure seemed to exist. Merchants exploited this desperation, raising prices and peddling jars of black dust as salvation. The poorer the people, the more likely they were to spend everything on a remedy that only deepened their suffering. By the end of the 17th century, the gruesome trade was too widespread to vanish overnight. Tombs continued to be raided, corpses continued to be boiled, and patients continued to swallow Pharaoh's dust. Yet a new force, science, was rising, and with it came the first real challenge to centuries of superstition and greed. The empire of mummy powder was beginning to crumble. As the 18th century dawned, skepticism grew sharper. Physicians conducting early experiments began to test mummy powder against common ailments. The results were damning. It healed nothing, cured nothing, and in many cases worsened the conditions it was supposed to treat. Yet the public clung to belief. Desperation makes fertile ground for superstition, and merchants exploited it, knowing fear of death outweighed reason. In Cairo, Egyptian locals watched with grief and anger as Europeans desecrated their ancestors. Entire necropolises were stripped bare. Priests in the old quarters warned that those who disturbed the dead would be cursed. Travelers wrote of markets where merchants bickered loudly over the price of a wrapped arm or a broken skull, as though trading grain or cloth. The spiritual insult was immeasurable, but profit drowned out reverence. Meanwhile, in Europe, mummy powder became a fashionable curiosity in salons. Aristocrats boasted of sipping wine mixed with the ashes of kings. Cabinets of curiosities displayed jars of powder alongside shrunken heads and exotic relics. The grotesque became glamorous, and death itself was commodified for entertainment. Guests raised goblets not just to health, but to horror, convinced they were part of something exotic and ancient. But whispers of illness spread. Letters between nobles reveal cases of sudden fevers, ulcers, and seizures after prolonged use. A French duke wrote bitterly that he had spent a fortune on what he called Egypt's ashes only to find himself bedridden. His confession was not public, too much pride was at stake, but it hinted at the growing realization that the cure was a curse. The backlash finally came when Enlightenment philosophers began to expose the trade. Writers like Voltaire mocked the absurdity of consuming corpses, calling it a banquet of death. Pamphlets circulated denouncing the apothecaries as charlatans. Slowly, ridicule began to unravel, centuries of belief striking harder than sermons or laws ever had. Yet the demand did not vanish instantly. In the shadows, desperate families continued to purchase mummy powder, especially during outbreaks of plague and smallpox. Some believed that if nobles once consumed it, it must hold power. Apothecaries, unwilling to lose profit, stocked counterfeit powders made of dried animals' bones or even dirt dyed black. The fraud was grotesque, but it proved that the myth had finally collapsed under its own weight. By the late 1700s, medical academies officially rejected mummy powder. Scientific experiments demonstrated its uselessness, and new medicines offered safer alternatives. The apothecary jars disappeared from public shelves, their labels scraped off, their contents discarded. But while the practice ended, its legacy of horror lingered. Tombs had been looted, cultures desecrated, and generations poisoned in the name of profit. Still, collectors clung to relics. Wealthy Europeans continued to import whole mummies not to grind, but to display. The obsession shifted from swallowing the dead to owning them, turning sacred remains into trophies. Egyptian bodies lay in private parlors and museums, stripped of dignity, their final rest forever denied. Folklore preserved the horror. In some villages, elders told children that swallowing mummy powder bound your soul to the dead, condemning you to wander after death. They whispered of nobles who rose from their graves with blackened mouths, cursed for devouring pharaohs. The tales may have been superstition, but they carried a kernel of truth, the horror of complicity and desecration. By the dawn of the 19th century, the mummy trade had transformed, but its shadow stretched far across history. What had once been medicine became myth, then spectacle, and finally a warning. The jars of powder were gone, but the memory remained proof of how ignorance, greed, and silence can conspire to turn the sacred into ash. As the 19th century progressed, fascination with Egypt exploded into what historians call Egyptomania. Europeans who once swallowed mummy powder now unwrapped entire bodies in public spectacles. In candlelit theaters, wealthy audiences gasped as linen was stripped from desiccated flesh. What had once been medicine became entertainment, but the underlying horror remained the same. The dead were never allowed to rest. These unwrapping parties blurred the line between science and spectacle. Some claimed they were for study, but the atmosphere resembled a carnival. Guests sipped wine as the bandaged remains of pharaohs and priests were exposed to applause. The same greed that had powdered mummies into medicine now transformed them into curiosities stripped bare for profit and pleasure. Egyptian voices, though silenced by colonial power, whispered resistance. Locals mourned the destruction of sacred tombs, watching as foreign hands robbed their heritage. They told stories of curses, warning that those who disturbed the dead would suffer misfortune. Tales of explorers dying mysteriously or collectors falling ill spread like wildfire, feeding Europe's obsession while condemning its arrogance. Ironically, the curse stories only deepened demand. Merchants marketed mummies as dangerous treasures, thrilling the wealthy who sought both danger and exclusivity. Every accident, every fever, every unexplained death of a collector was folded into legend. Pharaohs once ground into dust for healing were now imagined as vengeful spirits reclaiming dignity through fear. But behind the legends lay grim truth. Entire cemeteries had been looted, lineages erased, and artifacts destroyed. The demand for bodies, first as medicine and later as trophies, left scars on Egypt's landscape that endure to this day. Historians estimate that thousands of mummies were shipped abroad, their identities lost forever in jars, powders, and showcases. Scientific medicine eventually replaced superstition, but the moral wound did not heal. The Enlightenment's rejection of mummy powder was a step forward, yet it did not undo the centuries of desecration. Instead, it forced Europe to confront an uncomfortable truth in the name of survival and curiosity. It had consumed both flesh and culture. Some scholars of the era began writing scathing critiques labeling the practice as ritualized cannibalism. They argued that societies which condemned savages for eating flesh were themselves guilty of the same crime, only cloaked in velvet and Latin prescriptions. The hypocrisy was undeniable, yet few were willing to face it openly. In hidden cabinets of curiosity, dusty jars of mummy powder remained long after the trade ended. Some were forgotten, others passed down as heirlooms, still labeled with promises of vital strength. These relics sat like silent witnesses to centuries of horror, their presence a reminder of the lives consumed for nothing. Modern archaeologists often find fragments of desecrated tombs, bones, shattered wrappings, torn skeletons incomplete. Each fragment is evidence of the pillaging that once fed Europe's hunger. For them, reconstruction is impossible. Too much has been stolen, too much lost to fire, pestle, and greed. The bodies that were once whole will never be restored. And so the story of mummy powder is not just about a bizarre medical fad. It is about what happens when superstition, commerce, and silence collide. The dead were stripped of dignity, the living were poisoned, and entire cultures were plundered. What remains is a warning etched into history like the faint dust of the pharaohs still clinging to forgotten jars. The fascination with consuming the dead might sound like a strange relic of the past, but echoes of the mummy trade reached even into the modern era. Well into the 19th century, European doctors continued prescribing mummy tincture powder dissolved in alcohol as a last resort for the gravely ill. Desperate families accepted it, clinging to the hope that swallowing centuries-old flesh could somehow pull loved ones back from death's edge. Some writers of the Romantic period used the horror of mummy medicine as inspiration. In dark poems and Gothic novels, they described nobles raising goblets filled with black dust, only to find themselves cursed. The imagery of consuming Egypt's dead became a metaphor for Europe's own moral corruption, proof that civilization itself could be as savage as the practices it condemned abroad. By the mid-1800s, advances in chemistry and biology fully exposed the fraud. Laboratories proved mummy powder contained nothing curative, only decayed flesh, dirt, and resin. Scientists mocked earlier generations, asking how anyone could believe that the ashes of the dead were medicine. Yet the shame lingered. This had not been the folly of peasants alone, but of kings, queens, and the most educated minds of Europe. Collectors tried to erase their complicity. Many jars of powder were quietly discarded, their labels peeled away, their contents dumped into rivers and fields. But some remained hidden in attics and locked cabinets, too strange to throw away, yet too shameful to display. These remnants, discovered centuries later, still carry the bitter scent of pitch and decay. Even in its decline, the mummy trade mutated. Entire bodies, once destined for the pestle, were now sold to artists as cheap pigment. Ground into fine powder mummies were used to create a paint called mummy brown. Canvases across Europe still bear this grotesque legacy, landscapes and portraits tinted with the dust of human remains. Art like medicine had fed on the dead. Public reaction shifted as this truth spread. Newspapers condemned the practice, calling it both barbaric and absurd. Satirical cartoons depicted apothecaries scooping dust from sarcophagi as gullible nobles lined up with coins. Outrage mixed with shame as Europeans realized they had feasted on corpses in the name of health. The ridicule helped drive the final nails into the coffin of the mummy trade. But the legacy of horror cannot be erased so easily. In Egypt, countless tombs were emptied. Their treasures looted, their guardians ground into dust. The theft was not only physical, but cultural. Millennia of sacred burial traditions were violated, leaving scars that cannot be repaired. The greed of foreign powers consumed more than bodies, it consumed memory. Even today, echoes of the practice haunt museums and private collections. Mummies once destined for medicine now lie in glass cases stripped of dignity, their gaze fixed on visitors who stare at them as curiosities. Each display is a reminder that the West once swallowed the very flesh it now preserves behind glass. The line between medicine entertainment and desecration remains disturbingly thin. Historians argue that the mummy trade reflects a broader truth that when desperation meets ignorance, almost anything can be justified. The promise of life everlasting blinded entire societies to the horror of cannibalizing the past. It is not a tale of medieval folly alone, but of human weakness, our willingness to sacrifice morality for the illusion of survival. The story of mummy powder forces us to ask difficult questions. What taboos are we willing to break when faced with fear? What horrors do we excuse when dressed in the language of science or profit? The jars may be empty now, the powder's gone, but the warning lingers. Whenever greed and silence join hands, history shows us that even the sacred dead can be devoured. By the late 19th century, mummy powder had become a source of ridicule in medical circles, yet whispers of its use persisted in folk remedies. In remote villages, some apothecaries continued to sell mumia under different names, mixing it with herbs to disguise its origin. Even when science proved it worthless, the myth clung to life like a shadow that refused to fade. Archaeologists who traveled to Egypt during this time often stumbled upon the wreckage left by centuries of plunder. Tombs were stripped bare, sarcophagi smashed open, and skeletons reduced to fragments. They recorded scenes of devastation, skulls shattered by hammers, ribs scattered in the sand, linen ripped apart and left to rot. The hunger of Europe had turned burial grounds into wastelands. The cultural loss was immeasurable. Priestly mummies, queens, and even children had been ground into dust, their identities erased forever. Whole dynasties disappeared into jars of powder sold for pennies in apothecaries thousands of miles away. Egypt's history was not only stolen but consumed, leaving scars that still ache today. Some modern scholars call the trade a silent genocide of memory. It was not war that destroyed these ancestors, but commerce and industry that reduced the sacred to a product. Each jar of powder represented not only a body, but an entire tradition of reverence for the dead, obliterated by greed. Yet the fascination with mummy powder survives in strange ways. Museums sometimes display preserved jars or remnants, horrid curiosities that force visitors to confront the grotesque past. People stare in disbelief, asking, "Did our ancestors really swallow this?" The answer is yes, and the truth is darker than most can bear. Writers and filmmakers later transformed the legacy into horror stories. The idea of a cursed mummy seeking revenge was born not only from Egyptian myth, but from Europe's own guilty conscience. Deep down, society knew it had violated the dead, and the legends of vengeance reflected collective fear that the crime would not go unpunished. Today, historians debate how such a practice lasted for centuries. Was it ignorance, desperation, or willful blindness? The evidence suggests it was all three. People believed what they wanted to believe, that death could be conquered by consuming death itself. It was a lie that fed on hope, and hope can be stronger than reason. Some even argue that the mummy trade was an early warning of how easily science can be corrupted by profit. Physicians who knew better stayed silent, merchants who saw fraud kept selling, and nobles who doubted still drank. The cycle of complicity made horror possible not because everyone believed, but because too few resisted. In the end, mummy powder was not a cure, but a poison, both literal and moral. It poisoned bodies with decay and poisoned societies with greed. Its victims were not only the Egyptians whose remains were desecrated, but also the Europeans who consumed lies in the name of health. The trade revealed how fragile truth becomes when fear rules. And so the story of mummy powder closes with a warning. The jars are gone. The powder swept into history, but the temptation that created them is not. Whenever fear of death outweighs respect for life, whenever profit outweighs morality, the same horror can rise again in new disguises. The pharaohs may finally rest, but their ashes still whisper. What will you consume next when terror blinds you again?